Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on Medicare drug payments. My name is Pedro Salomao. I am the CEO and founder of Definitive Health Partners. We focus on market access strategies, insights and research, and strategic management consulting. I'm happy to have join us as well our partner company, Gettysburg Healthcare Consulting, and John Warren, who was a former officer at CMS for 22 years. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Pedro. And I'd also like to thank everybody for tuning in and listening to our webinar today. My name is John Warren. I'm the owner and principal consultant at Gettysburg Healthcare Consulting. I've been an industry consultant for about 10 years, focusing on Medicare coverage, coding, and reimbursement work for a range of clients within the healthcare space. Before I became a consultant, I worked for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services for 22 years, where I actually directed the development of payment policy and the creation of payment rates under the average sales price program for Part B covered drugs. So I'm really excited to be here today and share some information with our listeners.
Thanks, John. So to level set a bit of information from a high level, we know that the three major payers, Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial payers, make up the majority of covered lives. When I would build out the strategy, or a lot of our clients, they really do focus heavy on the commercial side and the Medicaid side. Sometimes Medicare is not pushed back, but just not as strong of a focus, but that might be a mistake, especially with the influence that Medicare has on the other payers. John, can you talk a little bit about that influence?
Yeah, that's a great point, Pedro. And you can see on the chart here that Medicare covers just shy of 20% of the total population, which really isn't a huge amount compared to the population covered by both commercial payers and by Medicaid. But really, Medicare has a disproportionate influence across the board on all members, whether they're members of a commercial policy or whether they're Medicaid. And that's really because a lot of times commercial insurance particularly will look to Medicare to sort of make first decisions. For instance, if Medicare makes a coverage decision or limits a coverage decision or even makes a non-coverage decision, a lot of times we'll see those commercial payers follow that track and make very similar or sometimes the same decisions. And even when it comes to rate setting, whether it's for a hospital service or for a physician service or a prescription drug, a lot of times commercial payers too will use that Medicare payment rate as sort of a baseline upon which to start their own negotiations with manufacturers. So it's really important for manufacturers, whether you are specifically targeting that over 65 population or not, to keep in mind how Medicare may react to your particular product and how that reaction might influence decisions made by others within the marketplace.
Terrific. And if we go down another layer and look at the four parts, obviously we're looking at the inpatient for Part A, the DRGs, the bundled payments, everything in the acute care setting. Part B is made up predominantly from a prescription perspective of rare disease, specialty therapies, physician-administered drugs. And if you look at the Med Advantage, and we'll talk a little bit more, that is obviously one part of the Medicare umbrella that is growing significantly. And then prescription drug benefit, Part D, which has been getting a lot of press. But it seems like Medicare specifically silos these departments or parts. Can you talk a little bit about its attitude and just it seems siloed approach? Is that by design?
Yeah, it kind of is by design, Pedro, and it's interesting. I don't know if we chose this graphic deliberately or whether it was subconscious or not, but you can see on the chart how we've got A, B, C, and D all sort of in their own little blocks, and there's really no overlap between the blocks, and that's pretty representative of the way the program is structured. Each of these areas is run by different groups within CMS. There's different people in each of those areas, obviously, and each of the groups has their own sort of priorities and needs and interests that oftentimes don't overlap with other areas. So a lot of times things that will happen in the inpatient world really have no bearing on the Part B, the physician world, or the Med Advantage, or even the prescription drug benefit world. And that's really important for manufacturers to understand, because as you're developing value propositions, as you're developing messaging to approach CMS, you want to make sure that you're presenting that messaging in the right way. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the presentation today.
So you brought up a great point, and again, I'm thinking from a manufacturing perspective from my past experience. We would have therapies, and we've seen clients with the same thing. It's typically not just part A. It's not just part D. A lot of these therapies actually do hit a number of different silos. So it made me think, well, from a value prop perspective, how is it different approaching and developing a value proposition for Medicare versus a commercial plan or a Medicaid plan?
Yeah, so I think the contents of the value prop, whether you're going to a commercial plan or to Medicare, are going to be very similar. It's really a message, really an issue, I should say, of what you emphasize in those value messages. So, in other words, if you go to address a commercial payer, you know that they're going to be more interested in sort of the broad range of health economic information. They're going to want to know about the clinical reaction or the clinical activity of a particular product, but they're also going to be interested in what does it cost and what's the impact on their overall health ecosystem. When you're talking about Medicare, while it's very important to consider cost and the impacts of those, that's really not as much of a driver of Medicare decision making as clinical outcomes are. Medicare really wants to know that the services that they're paying for, whether they're paying for them under Part A or Part B or even C or D, are medically necessary for their population. They want to make sure that what's being paid for is doing what it's supposed to be doing at the right level of specificity for the right patient population. And in those three things, nowhere comes up the discussion of saving money overall. And it's unfortunate, but that's the way the program is structured.
Yeah, that's terrific. So, we've focused, we want to really focus on the Part D side a little bit, or prescription drug benefit. And I know initially Medicare covered only hospital and physician administered drugs. Um, what can the evolution of Medicare, because I know the last 4 or 5 administrations have been looking to change legislation, but what can we learn from the past that will tell us a little bit more about future coverage and what it may look like?
Yeah, from my perspective, Pedro, with when it comes to coverage for prescription drugs, the debate has never really been about whether we need a prescription drug benefit. It's really been a debate about when do we get the prescription drug benefit and how does it get structured in a way that controls costs and prevents runaway spending. You can see on the chart here just about every administration from 1965, when President Johnson signed into law the Medicare and Medicaid programs, up until President Biden, every single administration just about has taken their own stab at creating either a legislative or a policy solution designed to address the lack of coverage of prescription drugs for Medicare seniors. But it really wasn't until 2003, when President Bush signed into law the Medicare Modernization Act, that we really started to see a prescription drug benefit. The MMA created what we know as the Part D benefit, and it sort of opened up the door for American elderly patients to get those prescription drugs covered by Medicare that beforehand were either covered by a supplemental policy or sometimes paid for out of pocket. And even since 2003, there have been attempts, both by all of the administrations since President Bush, to put their own marks on the prescription drug benefit through different policy solutions, different legislative solutions that were intended to control costs, control spending, but allow access to quality care for America's elderly population.
Yeah, so those are great points, John. Trying to curb cost, but keep access as optimal as possible. There's a number of factors that are really impacting how Medicare is going to be covered over the next few years. We can see that obviously Med Advantage or Medicare Advantage continues to increase significantly, with some projections saying by 2040 we'll see upwards of 70+% coverage on the Med Advantage side. And then obviously the spending, both from a Part B and Part D, continues to increase. Based on these factors, what's Medicare's attitude, and how are they going to look to manage this space?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want folks to think for a minute that Medicare is not concerned with the amount of money that they're spending on healthcare, because they absolutely are. And Medicare has seen that growth in spending, whether it be growth in hospital costs or growth in prescription drugs. And what CMS has tried to do over the past, I'll say maybe 10 years or so, is develop new tools and new payment systems that shift away from fee for service, where a provider is really rewarded or incentivized for quantity of work that they're providing, to a more pay for outcomes or a quality oriented scheme where providers are paid for the quality of the care that they provide. And we see this in the growth in Medicare Advantage. I mean, that's your traditional managed Medicare program. And as you show on the chart, the growth in Medicare Advantage has just been fantastic over the past 4 or 5 years, and surely will continue to grow. But we also see it in other things like accountable care organizations and other risk sharing models where providers are incentivized to reduce costs, but still meet high quality measures and have the opportunity to share some savings that come out of those increased or lowered costs, I should say, and increased quality.
Yeah. So you got me thinking a little bit, John, in terms of different models. And my experience at previous companies, it would entail just reaching out to law firms so that they could help us understand when and how to reach out to Medicare. I think the one thing was the responses tended to be a little bit cookie cutter, and lawyers do a great job. Um, these were, I think, just interpreting the law. So there was something that was a little bit missing. What's the best way to approach the issue of interacting with Medicare?
Yeah, that's really important to think about, because I think interacting with Medicare is a very nuanced, almost a dance, if you will, where manufacturers have to balance timing, audience, and messaging in order to come across as being credible to the agency. We've talked about this before, Pedro. You don't want to go into the agency and start talking about a product that's maybe in preclinical development, or maybe even phase 1 development, because that's just simply too early. You don't have enough scientific evidence to go into CMS and have a meaningful discussion about the product. And in that case, you run the risk of being seen as wasting CMS's time. And as you know, CMS has limited resources and what seems like an unlimited workload. So it's very important to manage that. At the same time, waiting until you're 3, 4, 6 months before launch, that may be too late in the game, because you want to balance the need to find where the pain points are at CMS and be able to address those with the agency in a way that you're not scrambling at the last minute to make changes or come up with different messaging. So, I think somewhere between a year to maybe a year and a half, most manufacturers that's a pretty good sweet spot where those discussions can start being had. But it's really not just about timing, Pedro. It's about who do you talk to? Do you want to go in and talk to coverage, or is coverage a given? Do you need to go in and talk about coding, or are there alternative coding solutions that are already existent? And do you need to talk about reimbursement? And, we talked about the siloed nature of CMS. That coverage, coding, and reimbursement, those activities, even though the activities are very closely related, they're run by different organizations within CMS. And to go to, say, the reimbursement area to talk about coverage, that's going to fall flat. You want to make sure that you're tailoring your message to who you're talking to, and you're providing a credible value proposition to them.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I think the when, again, some companies can figure that out, but really the who and the how. I mean, those were two aspects that were really difficult to figure out unless you have experience doing that. We talked about cost and overall budget. There's a number of factors that really go into what's going to instigate change, and we talked about the first one: problem, drug spending, any kind of rebating. But there's a number of factors that go into consideration of when the needle will be moved. John, in your opinion, in your experience, um, which one of these 2 or 3 variables or factors are really, really important that manufacturers should potentially focus on, and potentially make part of their strategy?
Yeah, I think the three things that are really going to move the needle at CMS are the ones we have on the chart listed as problem, politics, and policy. Obviously there has to be a problem that resonates with CMS, and that should go without saying. But second, the politics, the political environment, is there leadership at CMS that's going to be interested in taking on a particular problem? And then finally, policy. CMS tends to be a conservative agency. It doesn't like to sort of create things from scratch. It likes to build on what it already knows. So to the extent that certain policies may already be in place, or certain procedures may already be in place, and you can build a solution based on something that the agency already knows, already respects and understands, that gets you farther along in the process than trying to start something new.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, John, I want to thank you for your time. We're going to finish up just talking through what our next upcoming webinars are going to be, which are very valuable and important to integrate into everybody's strategies. This is based on market research we conducted with our clients and other manufacturers. They're all pretty important. I'm looking forward, no pun intended, to a look forward. I'd love to get your insight and from your crystal ball into what you think the next coming years would look like, so I could implement it into my market access strategy. Is there one or two of these webinars that you think are going to be really important or paramount for a manufacturer to include?
Yeah, here's the thing, Pedro. I'm kind of a pragmatist, right? So I think what's going to be really important and really exciting for our listeners is the discussion about navigating through Medicare. Because certainly we can talk about these other things, but really until you can implement those things that you understand in a way that's going to get you the responses that you want, you haven't achieved much. So I think having a discussion about a more detailed discussion, I should say, about the who's, what's, when's, and how's of approaching the agency is going to be really exciting.
Yeah, no, very helpful. John, I want to thank you for your time, and everyone who attended the webinar. Thank you. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to either John or myself. In the meantime, please like the video, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Take care.